Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 2, Episode 8. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Steve, this is kind of a funny question. You're located in Texas where the stores I hear are all open, but have you visited a retail store lately as often as the before time? Have your shopping habits changed now that you can visit stores?
Well, actually, for the most part, stores have been open. The big change here was that all establishments can go to 100% capacity and masks are not required. So that's a whole new dynamic. But I've been pretty conservative. I've mostly been to grocery stores and places like Target. I haven't ventured out much. I did make my first trip in about a year to the North Park Mall, which some listeners will know is a large upscale mall in the city of Dallas. And my observation there was, well, first of all, everybody was wearing masks. I'm not sure if the center required that, but lots of the retailers did. And, this is not super scientific, but I would say that the traffic looked a little bit light for Saturday, but it certainly was not empty. There was lots of cars in the parking lot, and that's been my general experience. So maybe, we should have asked Ethan, who we'll have on in a moment, whether we can get the actual stats for the North Park Mall, which I know they have. But anyway, I didn't think of doing that when we were talking now.
That's an interesting idea. Now, I'm at the opposite end of the spectrum where I am in Toronto, Canada. The stores and shopping malls have been closed for almost 120 days. So if you can imagine, and they are just open just recently in the Toronto area. 50% capacity for essential is what we, food and grocery, and pharma, and now 25% for everyone else. And interestingly, the big shopping center near me, Square One, has a counter at the top of their website that tells you capacity, and it hit 97, 98. They had to close the mall on Saturday. They had to shoo everybody away, if you can imagine. So clearly, people want to go back physically shopping. Now, some of that's pent-up returns behavior, but not all. I think, as you've often said, people didn't get the memo. Stores still matter.
Well, really, and we'll talk to Ethan a bit about this, but I think, traffic to grocery stores certainly has been strong, and to certain other categories. So now that obviously that depends a lot on what the particular situation was in your city or state or province or
can't go to the restaurant. You're going to get groceries more.
Right. So it's interesting, but I think really looking forward to this conversation with Ethan Chernovsky from Placer AI, where we're going to talk about the state of the art in measuring traffic and what we can do with that information. And I think it's an area that's really gotten much more advanced in the last few years. And I think the store traffic data is really fascinating in general, can really, I think, inform a customer insight strategy. I think it's going to be particularly helpful as we start to see how different sectors, different parts of the U.S. And other areas are recovering.
Yeah, it's interesting because you start to, how can you transfer lessons learned from different parts of the country, if you're operating nationally, for example, or if you're not, so you can start to transfer these learnings. And what you said there is really interesting, that how do I take this piece of data and not make it an orphan amongst other orphans in my data pool and connect it to other things that allow me to really understand that customer journey and my customers a little better, right? It feels like that's what you would be doing and do with your clients, as you say, listen, it's great data, but you need to connect it to other data, right?
Yeah, I think isolated pieces of data, like if you just looked at store traffic, you can certainly glean things like how are certain locations performing relative to other locations within your chain. You can certainly look at, particularly with data like from Placer, where you can see what's going on in the broader category with competitors, different parts of the country. I think there's a lot of things that basically give you clues as to whether you're underperforming or overperforming, and then you can dive into what the root causes of that might be. But I think in general, you need to have an overall customer insight strategy and be pulling on different levers to go after the places that you most need to improve, or have a warning system that maybe something is not quite working the way you expect it to or hope it would.
Well, right on. I was really looking forward to this interview with Ethan, because I wanted to get this sense of how to take data and AI together with these unusual shopping patterns of the COVID era, fewer trips, bigger baskets, and how that all affects the algorithm. So, without further ado, let's welcome Ethan and jump right into the conversation. Ethan, welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast. How are you doing? I'd say this afternoon, but where you are, it's this evening. So how are you this evening?
I am doing very well. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. Steve and I were chitting and chatting about the beginning of season 2, what things we wanted to explore, and certainly your world kind of came into our view in terms of, boy, how do we understand what is going on and who's doing the best practice in terms of measurement. But listen, I've kind of got ahead of ourselves. Why don't we start back at the beginning? Tell us about yourself, who you are, your journey, and all about your role in Placer.
Sure. So I am Ethan Chernovsky. I lead marketing for Placer. Placer is a location analytics and foot traffic data company. So if you think about it in the most basic terms, people vote with their feet, and we're showing you how people vote across the United States every day. Very critically, it's all anonymized aggregate data. So we are GDPR and CCPA compliant, kind of a privacy by design company. And essentially what we're focused on is trying to show what's really happening in the world of retail offline.
Now, when you say the world of retail, give me a sense for your company's scale and scope. You right now, I believe, are sitting in, I think you're sitting in Israel, but what's your scale? Do you cover all countries? Give me a sense of that.
Sure. So we are a U.S.-based company. It just so happens that our R&D and product teams sit here, a real focus on data science out of this ecosystem.
Yeah, not unusual there. You're not certainly such a great cluster, right, of great expertise for sure.
Sure. And especially within the data science side, which has been one of the kind of the core advantages we've been able to bring to the table. But we are a U.S. focused company. So our data is only for the U.S. at the moment, though there are plans for expansion in the future. And when we look at retail, we're looking at anything, anywhere in the U.S. So because we're using panel data and then estimations on top of it, we're able to make those predictions with a high degree of accuracy to any location, anywhere in the country.
So could you give us a little more detail on kind of how you make the sausage? Because I remember, I think when we first talked about a year and a half ago, I was fascinated by how you went about collecting this data, and I guess in particular how you can validate it against other data points to not only assess the accuracy of it, but what particular insights you can actually provide to clients.
Yeah, absolutely. So it starts with a panel of mobile devices. So we see about 30 million mobile devices throughout the United States. And then kind of as discussed, we have this really amazing data science team that utilizes the latest, algorithmic breakthroughs in machine learning and AI to make estimations to any location in the country. And I think one of the things that's really important to us is, data is wonderful, but only if it's utilized. So accessibility has always been a really important piece for us. And we have a tremendous product team that's taken all this data and all these insights and put them into dashboards that allow anyone to easily access that information. So you're not getting some massive Excel sheet. You're actually getting a tool that you can very quickly kind of understand what's really happening in the offline world, from, major retail change to a specific location to a shopping center anywhere across the country.
I know we're going to try to dig into a little bit more detail by category and so forth, but what would you say is a great use case for how a particular retail client might use your data? What actions would they take based on it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that makes me really excited about our product, and obviously I'm biased here, but is that it's going to be used across an organization. So the real estate team is going to be using it to figure out where they want to open up their next location, or if they're in a right sizing effort, which location to keep open or close. A strategy and operations team is going to use it for competitive intelligence to understand different processes that we're trying. So you have a new format and you want to see how it's performing compared to other kind of competitors and either other locations that you have within a specific area. And so this tool is going to be really valuable for that. From a marketing perspective, how do I measure the value of offline events? How do I kind of show the impact of what I'm doing? We have all these online data sources. Placer is allowing these correlations to take place in a really effective manner. And so I think what gets us really excited is that it's not a single use case in retail. It's really across a company that allows them, when you're able to see the world and view all of the retail landscape through a single lens, it opens up a lot of capabilities.
And is it fair to say that, in general, you'd have a lot more data for the national retailers, but if you're looking down at a particular shopping center or mall or whatever, right, you can look at the real estate patterns more broadly, not specific to a retailer, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the way it kind of works is we have POIs in the system that will cover about 80 to 85% of all retail locations. But, let's say you want to, slice and dice a certain area. So you have a massive center and you want to cut it in half. You can do that. And so there's a tremendous amount of flexibility in terms of what you can geofence and therefore what you can measure.
When I'm thinking about, as I'm listening to you describe it, I mean, when I talk to retailers, some don't even measure store traffic, right? They measure transactions because it's just too hard for them to get their heads around. Sometimes it's a franchisee organization, whatever that is. When I think about your data, are there any limitations we should know of? So, for example, when I was speaking with a retailer and they were saying our store traffic is down, they had store counters, but they attributed it to the fact that in the COVID era, people are going individually. They're not going with their family. They're not bringing the kids to go, shop for back to school supplies. And so the count looks low, but the reality is the shop is still the same. How do you guys factor those kind of weird variables in, or do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, yes, there are changes in the market based on a whole variety of factors. And obviously COVID is an extreme case, but it doesn't make it less important to understand that full funnel. So imagine you have, revenue data for a specific location. I mean, that's really important, but don't you want to understand how the patterns are shifting? So if people are coming less often, but they're buying more, that's going to change the way you approach each customer, change the way you approach the overall experience, what you attempt to do with your marketing efforts on a location by location basis. And even more, what about benchmarking? So it's wonderful that you know how your store is performing, but what about your competitor? How well are you doing, not just compared to your own numbers, but in context? And I think that's one of the biggest things that we talk about of your data is wonderful and it's really important. And we're going to help you understand that data better and we're going to help you utilize it to great effect. But your data, the silly example is if I tell you I'm the most handsome person in my town, that doesn't mean much if there's only 3 of us, and so I think it's really context is so critical and we're able to provide really valuable context.
Okay, I'm going to use that metaphor once or twice. I was going to say, anyway, it's a good use. It's a good use.
I knew where you're going with that.
Yeah, I wasn't sure where you're going with that. Let's talk about the before time. So before we get to talking about COVID, let's talk about, let's call it a historical perspective. What is, if you and I were having this conversation, a year and 2 months ago, pre-COVID, what would we be talking about in terms of trends and things that you were looking at and things that you were sharing with your clients?
So I think unsurprisingly, a lot of the things that we would have been talking about pre-COVID are things that we're talking about, in the midst of COVID, just with a lot more focus on them. So things like the rise of product or direct-to-consumer companies offline being a really significant trend. This is something we wrote a white paper around in 2019. Think about companies like Nike expanding offline, Lululemon, Untuckit, Everlane, Warby Parker, and the impact that they're having on the retail landscape, in our opinion, a very positive impact. The change in malls is a really big topic. We were talking about pre-pandemic, how it's being reimagined from those kind of tier one class A malls to a B or C class mall, and what that change would mean for the wider retail landscape. And so interestingly, this terminology of the great accelerator, it's not crazy, and it actually has a lot of validity when you look at the data.
It's interesting. I think about the qualitative nature of traffic, either before, now, or after. And I think about curbside and I think about returns. Kohl's recently talked about how much taking Amazon returns was driving their store traffic. And we all know that many, many retailers stood up curbside. Now that creates a visit to the parking lot. Do you understand that, or do both those things somehow get interpreted in your data? Or is that am I asking too much of your AI?
So it depends. If we try to weed out really short visits, because for most retailers that visit doesn't mean all that much. Now, to be fair, we do have a short visit function for QSR restaurants, for example, because a 3-minute visit for takeaway at a McDonald's means a very different thing than a 3-minute visit to a Walmart.
Now, you probably had to adjust that algorithm, right? Because people are like, I want to go to the store and get out. There's not a lot of lingering in the COVID era.
true, but to what extent, let's say? So think about how many retail trips we take that only take 2 or 3 minutes. And it's not many. And in fact, what we've seen on the BOPIS side in most cases is that it's not as fast as we're making it seem in the larger majority. But yes, I think when you think about what location data misses out on, I think it's much more kind of the peripheral elements. So things like sentiment is not something we could pick on, whereas like a social geo data would be able to pick up on that. Online data is obviously a really important piece of the puzzle that we're not going to see. But I think, the more evolved companies are understanding how to use those data sets together. And, we believe that our data set is obviously core, but certainly not seeing everything.
So I have a 2-part question related to the pandemic times, I guess, as we actually were in COVID. One is, I think this topic has probably been picked over pretty well in terms of, the reallocation of spending to essential retailers and home goods and things like that. But first question is, I'm curious whether you saw anything different in your data that perhaps fought with the kind of overall narrative that's been developed. And then secondarily, more recently, are you starting to see any changes in patterns, either in total by category or even in certain geographies?
Sure. So when you think about when we talked about like essential retail early on, obviously we saw unique strength in grocery and home improvement. So brands like Home Depot and Lowe's have put up incredible numbers throughout the pandemic. But there are sectors that, we were really surprised by. And I think one of them was home improvement. The idea that they did well when they were open and they were essential retail, that's a narrative that makes a lot of sense and something that we expected. But we didn't expect Lowe's to be up 20% in November still. We certainly didn't expect it to continue into 2021, but it's what's been happening. And that's, I think, really exceptional to the power of these brands to leverage a moment to do something that provides a long-term boost. And when we think about trends that are changing, I'll give an example of Starbucks. There's a lot of brands that are very focused on routine. So they fit within the way that we operate in quote unquote normal times. And that could be a gym that I go to before work. And it could be a Starbucks that I go to grab my coffee at 10 in the morning or at 6 a.m. on my way in and, on my commute, or convenience stores. And one of the things that we're seeing interestingly in Starbucks is we looked at data the week of March 1st, so a 7-day period. And we saw that the percentage of visits that happen between 6 and 9 a.m. is actually moving closer to 2019 levels than at any time before in the pandemic. So we are seeing this return to normal routines, which is really significant for a lot of brands that have built themselves around these routines.
Now, when we talk about, so my second question, I guess, was getting more towards maybe things like there was this narrative that, or some data, I guess, that suggested that apparel was making a bit of a resurgence, and that maybe folks like Kohl's and so forth were starting to do better. Is that what you're seeing in your data?
Yeah, absolutely. Kohl's was actually, we did a piece in early this year, so I think we put it out like the last week of December, and it was our picks for who is going to kind of outperform this year. And one of them was Kohl's. And I think what we saw was in early January, a lot of brands saw a pretty big pickup. And I think it was this post-holiday, there's returns. Do we, maybe, you got a gift card for Christmas, and then we saw visits really dive in late January and early February. But a lot of that was because of inclement weather. So severe weather conditions in the Northeast, in the South, and the impact that had on retail. But when we look at mid-February through early March, there is a very clear recovery trend happening. And if it carries through in the spring, as the weather starts to pick up, as hopefully COVID's impact starts to dissipate, that's going to bode very well for apparel brands, especially mall-based ones that had been hit especially hard. And I think it could mean very positive things moving forward.
Now, is that indexed to 2019 or is that over last year? Because I think that's one of the real challenges. There was such a distortion in spending and traffic caused by COVID that the comparison to 2020 might not be such an interesting comparison.
I agree with you completely. And what's interesting is January and February, you're pretty okay because the retail impact started happening late February, early March in 2020. But that's why I think the early March data is interesting, because we did compare it year over year when there was this kind of mini surge in retail as we're like, oh no, we might be shut down. Let me go get in this last shop. And it was doing strong compared to that. What we have been doing moving forward is doing kind of a dual comparison, which is let's compare 21 to 20. Just even though we know the numbers are going to be exaggerated in many cases, but then let's also compare it to 19 to give us some point of context. And even in January, take a Planet Fitness, we looked at their data year over year and then year over 2 years, and it's a very different picture. And it does kind of remind you that don't go crazy about the year over year data. Remember the brands you're talking about. Remember how strong they were pre, and try to really determine, did anything fundamental change? Because if nothing did and they were doing great before and the situation hasn't shifted something in a fundamental way, they're likely going to do well after.
But are you finding that some of your clients are trying to marry your data with a lot of other sources of data? Like, for example, we can at least, in the US, obviously, there's been quite a lot of stimulus spending. There's now another round of stimulus. Certain retailers might be more prone to one-time big ticket purchases. So trying to glean how much of this is I guess, sustainable, even in kind of post-stimulus world and post-COVID world. Any of that kind of stuff going on? Any guidance there?
I mean, I think, the two parts of your question are kind of, I guess, the impact of the stimulus and then kind of the utilization of this data with other data sets. And in terms of utilizing it with other data sets, I think, yeah, that's a great way to look at it. There's a lot of things you can glean from location data. There's a lot more things you can glean from location data when you use it alongside geosocial data or more advanced demographics or online data. And I think understanding the way these things interact is really important. But even, we talked about weather. I mean, think how important it is to have that context in mind of, or even something simpler. I was talking to someone, a week ago, and they were like, February is really down. I was like, yeah, it is really down, but there was crazy weather. And also there's a day less in February 21 than there was a year prior. So we have to, these things are so easy to forget, but they're really important from providing that full picture in order to understand the data at its best.
Well, I'm curious about this intersection that we kind of keep coming back to, and I'm going to put it to you as a question. Again, this may be too much to ask, but I look at this intersection of the variant and the vaccines in different places in America getting different levels of vaccination, and at the same time, different perspectives or different philosophies, right? So Texas is more open than New York City, and probably Florida is more open than Texas. And I'm trying to understand if you can see or parse in your data if consumers are normalizing their behavior in some ways by looking at different regions and then helping us understand what's going to happen in the back half of the year when things overall become more normalized and you've got more people vaccinated and more retail opening up. Any sense for what, if you put your prediction hat on?
So the first piece
what are you learning?
I think there's a few pieces. So the first is every location operates differently. And even when you break down a state, it operates very, very differently. Mm-hmm. And we have, a migration analysis tool that looks at kind of population shifts in areas. And it's, even that, it has very dramatic effects between New York and California, because in California, people move to a different, county and they're still within California. From New York City, you move to a different county and you're in New Jersey or Connecticut. And New York is still you're orbiting around the city, but it's a different state. So what does that mean? But when you look at it from a retail perspective, we do see different regions operating very differently. And so, New York versus Florida versus Texas. And essentially what we see is as there is more opening and the system comes back, the people come back very quickly. The big factor, I think, is a state like California. So there are a lot of retailers who have the bulk of their locations in California, and California has lagged far behind other states in terms of retail visits, because of the way the state approached COVID. And I think as California is able to open up more, expect to see a lot of retailers see sharp upticks in terms of their visits and their in-store revenue as a result.
So I guess, as Steve would often say, many of these stores didn't get the memo that stores were out of out of favor.
Michael, physical retail is dead. I don't know where Ethan gets all this data.
I think Steve, boring retail is dead. Actually, sorry, Ethan. We're just riffing here back and forth.
No, I mean I agree. It's not just boring retail. It's a limited perspective on retail that's dead. And so if you think of, I mean, again, I just think it's such a fascinating topic, these direct-to-consumer companies and product-oriented companies expanding their offline footprint. And I think a big reason why they're doing it is it's a place to sell products, but it also improves their logistics. It improves their marketing power. It improves their ability to take in returns, which is a huge cost for an online-only retailer. And I think when you start to realize, wow, there's all of these other levels I can hit with a location, you realize that offline retail is not just about selling the product. And that's the key to recognizing why it's still very strong and likely not becoming weaker as many expected it to.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I think the other thing is, as you probably know, a lot of I think your data certainly has shown over the last couple of years, an ongoing trend of, off-price dollar stores doing well, while department stores and mall-based retail, generally speaking, not doing well. That's not a new phenomenon, right? It's just one that's perhaps accelerated, as we talked about earlier. So, well, we're coming up on our time, Ethan. I just wondered, was there anything else you wanted to add before we wrapped up that we didn't get to that you think is important?
I mean, I'll riff off what you just said. I mean, I think the department store case is a really fascinating one. Why is it an issue of the format? Is it an issue of there's too many of them? Are there ways to reinvent the format? Is Target not really kind of just a form of department store that's nailed it? What about something like Neighborhood Goods that brings in kind of direct to consumer companies within that model? So I even when you look at the data for a Macy's or a JCPenney, these aren't stores that are struggling to bring in people. They're just struggling to bring in people at the levels they were before. And I think that sector, like so many others, needs to evolve and improve. But I feel a lot more bullish about what its long-term potential could be as they start to get more of these things right.
Well, we'll have to bring you back for Department Store Fight Club. Yeah. That's a different pod. Maybe we'll have a Retail Fight Club or something.
Well, location fight club, traffic fight club,
conversion
spinning
fight
off
club.
your .com fight club.
Yeah, it's going to be really in the weeds. Well, but we can probably get 10 or 12 listeners for that, so that'll be great. Well, Ethan, thanks. There's a bazillion things we could go into, I'm sure, but really appreciate you coming on and giving us a sense of what you guys are up to. I would encourage people to check out Placer, and we'll probably get a few links in the show notes if people want to check out some of your reports. But thanks again. I'm hoping to get to Tel Aviv at some point in the not too distant future. So we'll try to catch up here in the States with the vaccine progress you guys have made in Israel.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great to be here, and look forward to doing the live, video podcast when you are doing the tour of Tel Aviv.
Sounds good.
Look forward to Israel letting me in.
You're Canadian. You'll get in. It's the Americans you got to watch out for.
All right, it's time for Remarkable or Forgettable. Steve, February sales in the United States. I'm looking at the numbers and the media, what the media chases after. Were the numbers in your mind remarkable, or what did you think of them?
Well, I think the numbers themselves were forgettable. I think the way the media picked up on it was remarkable in that the headlines I saw, at least most of the headlines I saw, were all about how February sales changed relative to January and that they were down. So that was a cause for concern. And I think that's a really weird take because in my experience, February is always lower than January. Not only is it a shorter month, but January, you've got all this post-holiday activity and so forth. So I thought that was an interesting take. If you actually look at the year-over-year numbers, which I think is a better indication, retail was up overall about 2% if you take out auto and grocery. And that number was weighed down quite a bit by apparel and accessories, which continue, to be challenged, I think, for obvious reasons. So actually, I thought February was a pretty good month, not a cause for concern. So interesting take there. But I think, certainly we're now getting to this interesting period where comps will be really relative to the COVID times as opposed to last February was a relatively typical month.
Yeah, it's going to be a weird season of comps for everybody from working a budget to understanding what the heck's happening, right? Because we're just about to hit, March, April, May numbers, which are going to look just odd. everywhere, right? So, all right, speaking of odd, Amazon now declared somehow, I don't know who declared them, but they're now declared the top apparel retailer in the United States. That could be just of tube socks, but what do you think?
Well, to your point, I think a lot of that mix is much more commodity type items and kind of driven by, they didn't provide any, I don't think we saw any real detail on that number. But I think when you think about Amazon apparel, for the most part, it's more sort of commodity basic kinds of items, which have done, if there's a part of apparel that's done well, it's been, that sort of stuff, not the fashion piece. But, it's hard to underestimate Amazon's effect on the whole industry. So it's a pretty remarkable number. It'll be much more interesting in going forward to see whether they actually get any real traction in fashion and the higher end part of the market. So kind of a TBD on the remarkability of that longer term.
All right, let's stick with Amazon. Their grocery concept, Amazon Fresh, is expanding. I think they're opening up in Chicago, I believe.
Well, a bunch of markets. So they opened the first Amazon Fresh stores last year, and I think this week's news was that they're going to open another 28, which, in the scheme of things is not a ton of stores, but I think it suggests that they're pretty committed to going into the mainstream apparel business. So I think it's pretty remarkable. And I think, the interesting part of the story as they continue to invest behind it is how it shapes the dynamic of grocery overall. And I think, we're going to just continue to see the upping of the ante on convenience and price pressure and all that kind of stuff. So possible race to the bottom, but good for consumers.
Well, I think the story punches above its weight because it's 28 stores. So what? I mean, there's 400 plus Whole Food stores, which they also own. But I think notionally what they do with those stores is more important than how many stores there are, at least in the short term.
Yeah.
I think let's talk about, speaking of interesting, let's talk about Adidas declaring 50% DTC. Wow, right?
Yeah, I think this is remarkable. It's very much in keeping. To a certain degree, what's not remarkable about it is it's basically a copy of what Nike has been doing, which is to double down on e-commerce, invest maybe not as much behind their own stores, pulling back from wholesale. But I think we've been seeing this trend towards manufacturer, vendor, these big brands really leaning into D2C, both to control the brand experience and to have a direct relationship with consumers and possibly to improve their margins. So, one of the things they said in the story that I read about it was that they expect 80% of their incremental growth to come from direct to consumer. So when you think about a business that's been very reliant on wholesale for decades, right? This is a pretty big shift. But I think it's it's really keeping in a trend we're seeing overall in the market.
Well, speaking of stores, some news out from our friend, I believe, Deborah Weswig, talking about more stores opening than closing, which, again, I guess a bunch of people aren't getting that memo that stores are dead.
Yeah, facts are stubborn things. We keep seeing that physical stores, they just won't die. I think it's pretty remarkable in that it continues to play against this retail apocalypse narrative, which, as you know, I don't think either of us were really subscribing to that. I'm not surprised at one level, but I think part of the issue with some of the numbers is that I think Coresight's numbers are really among larger chains, not so much smaller chains. I think IHL has better data. That's a broader data set. So it's a little hard to parse out what's really driving it. But I think thematically, the idea that stores are dead is certainly not true. And the idea that many retailers are investing behind physical, both because of its role in the overall shopping experience, but also probably being driven or will be driven more by some good rent deals as we go ahead.
Well, yeah, and I see it also is an indication of the increasing bifurcation because, some dollar store discounts are really talking about opening up some big numbers. And when I saw this information, my first thought was, I think a lot of small indies are really struggling, particularly if they're small apparel or relying on tourism. So I think, I don't know how you grab that whole number, but I think it's a good positive trend, but it may or may not be the entire story in the entire spectrum of retail. But it certainly fights against, as you said, the retail apocalypse narrative, which is what you and I first met and bonded on. I would say when we first met for in Toronto and started talking about it, we were aligned from that from pretty much minute one. So, all right, well, listen, that was remarkable or forgettable. Another episode. We'll be back next week. Listen, let's bring this episode to a close. We've got we'll get back next week to more great guests who lend us their insight and tap into their wisdom. But for now, Steve, take us home.
Well, if you like what you heard, subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you can catch up with all our great interviews and insights, and new episodes will show up every week. And please take a minute to drop us that elusive 5-star review. I'm Steve Dennis. The expanded and completely revised second edition of my best-selling book, Remarkable Retail: How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption, is out in April. Pre-order your copy right now at Amazon, Indigo, bookshop.org, or just about anywhere else books are sold.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, producer and host of the Voice of Retail podcast, and you can learn more about me on www.meleblanc.co. Have a safe week, everyone, and Steve, talk to you again soon.